heartland in the late 19th and early 20th century. However, the fact of the matter is that because of perhaps, you know, a certain neglect that Malviji faced, he is often reduced to merely an educationist. I remember reading in many documents, government documents, and other sources, I mean, not recently, but earlier, describing Madan Mohan Malviya as an educationist. Now, the fact of the matter is that yes, Malviji was an educationist, but he was much more than that. He was a great freedom fighter. He was a great institution builder. He was a reformer, one of the foremost reformers of the Hindu religion and society. And he played a very important role in the legislative arena, in the legislative arena for almost 30 years. So far as I can remember now, he was a member of the United Provinces Legislative Council for perhaps a decade and of Imperial Legislative Council for almost 2 decades. And he played a very important role, for example, in the abolition of the indentured system. The bill for, so far as I remember, for the abolition of indentured labor was moved by Malviji in 1917. And the speeches of Madan Mohan Malviya in both the legislative councils, of course, they are very very important as they deal with almost all the important concerns that the freedom fighters had during that period. So Madan Mohan Malviya is one of those crucial personalities of modern India who played their role just like many others in various fields, and therefore it is his recognition in all the fields that needs to be taken into account, and not only his recognition to the field of education, where of course his role was very very sterling in founding the Banaras Hindu University. So it gives me immense delight that Dr. Bhuvan Jha, who is our fellow, has taken for this lecture a topic on which not much useful work has been done. Not many people have written about the legislative career of Madan Mohan Malviya, and he has been, as I said, no seen through one prism only, that of education and building of Banaras Hindu University. However, the fact of the matter is that in social, religious, cultural, political, in all fields, Madan Mohan Malviya was a key presence for almost 60 years, and there is no doubt that he was one of the greatest among the founders of modern India. So with these few words, I would now like to welcome Dr. Bhuvan Jha to start his lecture. Bhuvan ji, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ravikant Mishra ji, and thank you for agreeing to chair this session. Thank you, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, for supporting this project. Our former director, Mr. Shakti Sinha, has also joined this webinar. Thank you so much to you, sir. Thank you, the research wing, which is supporting the project and organizing these talks and seminar. Dr. Narendra Shukla, head of the Research and Publication Division, Rajnish Ranjan is here with us. Mr. Iqbal, Mr. Saurav Rai, who is also here with us. Mr. Tiwari, who is handling the technology aspect. Many of historian colleagues are also around. Many fellow colleagues like Rita Banerjee and Janki Abraham. I can also see many of my friends from Delhi University, Shambhunath Dubey, Aditya Narayan Mishra, Anupam Sani, Baisali, my old friend from Delhi University Administration, Mr. Dr. Sikandar, M.A. Sikandar, Amrit Kaur is also here, Narottam Vineet, Sandeep Verma from Satyavati College, Samita, my friend from Satyavati, Anju Agrawal, Sushant Mishra, and I can see many more names here. Thank you so much for being here for this important talk. I should say important from the perspective that Madan Mohan Malviya, as Ravikant Mishra ji has rightly pointed out, his cherished career in legislatures has not been sufficiently captured. For almost 3 decades, he was an important part of legislatures in India, first in the UP Legislative Council from 1902 to 1913, and in the Imperial Legislative Council, which subsequently became the Central Legislative Assembly from 1910 to 1930. During his long stint of 2 decades inside the central legislature, he rallied and led the nationalist opposition. Excellence at public speaking, strong knowledge of legal aspects, its multiple dimensions, implications, sensitivity to causes involving countrymen at large, both in terms of democratic institutions as well as in terms of economic welfare, urge to assess an issue in all its dimensions, including its evolution through history, and the practice of backing the argument with strong evidences made him a frontline nationalist leader inside the legislatures. His interventions were long, apt, and nuanced. Appealing to the modern ideas of liberty, democracy, and progress, his addresses encapsulated the demands of the enlightened and the layman alike. From the British side, he cited the examples of Gladstone, Ripon, A.O. Hume, and among the early nationalists, he drew inspiration from Dadabhai Naoroji, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Surendranath Banerjee, and Firoz Shah Mehta, among many others. Whether it was his continuous demand for self-government or abolition of indentured labor, or his stiff opposition to press bill or seditious assembly bill, or his fiery speech against the Rowlatt bills and the indemnity bill, his interventions stood out. His strong convictions on preserving handicraft industries, creating an enabling environment for modern Indian industries, or unearthing the reasons for the growing Indian poverty were on full display inside the Imperial Council. His leadership in the central legislature also enabled the non-official Indian members to unify on most occasions. In short, Pandit Malviya's leadership of the nationalist movement and his notable contributions inside the legislatures each worked to strengthen the other. His first notable public speech was from the platform of the Congress at Calcutta in December 1886. This was the second session of the Congress, and he was just 25 years old then, and he rose to speak in favor of the proposal on self-government, which was moved by famous nationalist Surendranath Banerjee. A.O. Hume, who subsequently prepared the report of the proceedings of the second session, wrote in the introduction that perhaps the speech that was most enthusiastically received was one made by Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya, whose fair complexion and delicately chiseled features, instinct with intellectuality, at once impressed everyone, and who, suddenly jumping on a chair beside the president, poured forth a manifestly impromptu speech with an energy and eloquence that carried every eye before them. Proposing his name as the Congress president in December 1909, Surendranath Banerjee referred to Malviya as the silver-tongued orator of the Congress. Sachidanand Sinha, a close associate, heard him speak for the first time at Allahabad Congress in 1888. The first impression of him as a public speaker that Sinha gathered then grew steadily thereafter as they worked together in the council and outside. These are the words of Sachidanand Sinha ji. Pandit Malviya is unique in the sense of being the only public speaker who tries to persuade the audience, not by reason of the power and vehemence of his language, but by great tact, wonderful gentleness, and extraordinary charm, coupled with the most easy-flowing fluency, which all combined produce upon the hearer's mind and attention a soothing sense and at once carry conviction to it. His work in the Prayag Hindu Samaj, which was founded in 1880 while he was a student at Muir Central College, gave him the first experience of public speaking. The Congress platform came as a big shot in the arm. Hume later insisted that Malviya pursue a degree and career in law. This allowed him to look at the legal aspects of an issue. His love for Swadeshi and inclination towards journalism brought him closer to the public cause. His initial political interventions were largely in line with those of the early nationalists or moderates, who sought expansion of self-government and who were very strong with their facts and figures. In Gladstone and Ripon, this first generation of nationalists saw a glimmer of hope. Writing in 1907, at a time when first Curzon and then Minto had become highly unpopular for their policies, Malviya aptly recalled Ripon's legacy. He called Gladstone a good judge of the inner virtues of a person, reflected in his trusting Ripon with the viceroy's post. Commending Ripon's work in the field of self-government, agriculture, and education, Malviya underlined that unlike Minto and Curzon, Ripon believed in doing and not merely in preaching. In his maiden speech at the Calcutta session in 1886, speaking in support of the resolution on self-government, Malviya appealed to the virtues of liberty and right. Quote, I will only add, may the cause of the people of India, the cause of liberty and right, engage the attention, heart, and soul of every honest Englishman in India and in England. And may each true Briton who values the rights, the privileges, the freedom which have made him and his country what they are, aid us, like true Britons, to the fruition of our aspirations for equal rights, equal privileges, and equal freedom. At the very next session in Madras in December 1887, he complained that neither the Indian affairs were being managed properly, and nor were Indians being allowed to manage themselves. They will not do their duty to the country themselves, and they will not allow us to do it. Can anything be more cruel or more unjust of the English nation, which professes to love freedom and justice and boasts itself as the founder of constitutional and free government? Gentlemen, after this, I think nothing need to be said by England about justice and freedom if this concession is not granted to us. The bill for amending the Indian Councils Act of 1861 was introduced in the British Parliament in 1890. Around this time, the Congress session was to be held in Calcutta in December 1890. Malviya, who spoke on this occasion, while appreciating certain aspects of the revision amendment, he said that there is one vital point, and without that, the whole structure would fall. That was the manner of appointing members to the council. And it was this omission which appeared most disappointing to him. And he said that the government wished to nominate all the members, and we asked for the privilege of electing half of them. How evidently simple and just our prayer, and how utterly indefensible the unwillingness of government to grant it. The privilege of selecting one's own council is not denied even to the most abundant of criminals under the British rule. Why then should it be denied to the loyal and intelligent subjects of our gracious majesty? Could there be anything more in conflict with reason and justice? He got elected to the Provincial Council of United Provinces in 1892. It was under the Indian Councils Act of he got elected in 1902. It was the seats were there under the Indian Councils Act of 1892. It was first an election of 2 years. Then he was re-elected in 1904, 1906, and 1908. First three elections were uncontested. The fourth election was a contest. He was on all four occasions. He was a nominee of the Allahabad Municipal Board. And when the council was expanded after the Act of 1909, he was elected again in 1910. After a few months, he was elected to the Imperial Council also through the same route. So from 1910 to 1913, he concurrently served in the UP Legislative Council as well as in the Imperial Legislative Council. Inside the UP Council, he criticized government's administrative and financial policies, inviting its attention to the miseries that befell the common people. He also pleaded with the government for material, educational, and moral upliftment of people. In this council, as the newspaper leader put it, Malviya distinguished himself by the display of combined moderation and ability, a spirit of independence, as well as a sense of responsibility. His remarkable speeches on the Bundelkhand Land Alienation Bill, the Excise Bill, and the annual financial statements brought out these qualities. His maiden speech on the Bundelkhand Land Alienation Bill showed that he had acquired a thorough knowledge on the subject, along with all the adverse impact that the revenue settlements had on the landowners, driving them into the clutches of the money lenders. Therefore, the remedy for checking land alienation, he stressed, lay not in enacting this law, but in reducing the land revenue demand and to rationalize the system of collection. In his budget speeches, year after year, in the UP Council, he demanded an increase in expenditure on education, public health, and industrialization, and sought reduction in provision for police. Therefore, by 1909, when an announcement was made in the last week of December 1909 for electing him as the president of the Lahore Congress, the Madras Standard newspaper published from Madras noted about Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya. On every important issue now before the country, Pandit Malviya has expressed himself clearly and unambiguously, so that the public need not be in doubt as to what his view will be on the several questions that will come before the Lahore session of the Congress. He has been a strict constitutionalist who understands the practical difficulties which a public man in India has to face. He has been a practical politician in the best sense of the term. Inside the central legislature, to which he was elected for the first time in 1910 and then continued till 1930, barring the 3-year period of 1920 to 1923, when he did not seek election due to non-cooperation movement. Here he emerged as a great proponent of self-government, opposed ordinances and vehemently criticized the press bill, seditious assembly bill, Rowlatt bills, public safety bill. Ultimately, he was a great advocate of ensuring individual liberty in all its dimensions. He wished to minimize army expenditure and sought Indianization of armed and civil services, also sought simultaneous examination in England and in India. He voted time and again against the financial bills. He was a big critique of policies on foreign tariff, which favored expansion of British interest in India and therefore opposed imposition of duties on silk cloth and protection provided to British-made cloth. In 1910, the very first few months in which he joined the Central Council, Imperial Legislative Council, he emerged as a big champion of individual liberty. His interventions during the discussions on the Press Act and the Seditious Meeting Act, they reflect this virtue of Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya. He had already founded Abhyuday in 1907 and also had helped to found the Leader, an English daily from Allahabad in 1909. He had also edited Hindustan, a newspaper founded by Raja Rampal of Kalakankar. And so he had a very good experience in journalism. So he was naturally an advocate of freedom of press. So when this bill came up for discussion in the assembly, in the Central Council, he rose to speak. This was on 4th April 1910. The bill was moved by Herbert Risley to provide for the better control of the Indian press. Madan Mohan Malviya, in his intervention, laid threadbare different provisions of the bill. He concluded that it would put a lot of constraints on the freedom of operation of the press and expression of liberty. If the liberty given to individuals and to the press was transgressed, then there were already sufficient existing provisions under the ordinary criminal law and the Newspaper Incitement to Offences Act of 1908. He particularly opposed the new provision in the proposed bill, which empowered the local government instead of the magistrate to decide what matter fell within the definition of prohibited matter and what did not, citing the speech of Gladstone in the House of Commons in connection with the Vernacular Press Act of 1878, that the bill had raised a political question of great importance, of the utmost delicacy. Malviya said whether it was wise for the government to appropriate the power of determining what writing is seditious. He warned that there was a real danger that the provisions of the bill would affect the legitimate liberty of the press. Then the Seditious Meetings Act, which had been promulgated in 1907, was going to expire, and the Home Member brought it for renewal for another extension for another 6 months. Malviya underlined that the council, especially its non-official members, were answerable to the countrymen. Their conduct was being watched. We feel that we are to be judged not by this council only, but also by the much larger and far more important body of our countrymen, who are keenly watching the conduct of non-official members as well as that of members of the government in dealing with any legislation which affects them. Then he went on to compare the situation that existed back in 1907 and said that, my lord, that accused disorder had almost died before that ordinance was issued in November 1907. It certainly did not exist when in November 1907 the government decided to pass the present act. The member who had introduced the bill, Malviya demanded, must satisfy the council that these conditions similar to 1907 existed even in 1910. My lord, what are the conditions which exist now? Do they make even the faintest approach to the conditions which existed in 1907? He referred to several instances when mobs had been dispersed quietly under Section 144. Government has sufficient powers under existing law to deal with every individual case, but conferring of this general power of proclaiming an area by which the voice of the whole population there may be silenced is most dangerous and unjust. Referring to the Press Act and the present act, he underlined they had already given illustrations of the old Edis, they means the British government, that the sight of means to do ill deeds often makes ill deeds done. Therefore, so long as these two measures remain on the statute book, so long will all efforts to conciliate to public opinion generally be beset with unnecessary difficulties. Malviya was a very strong advocate for abolition of indentured labor. He had been watching the developments since Gandhi raised this point in 1909, and when Gokhale proposed a bill 1910 which was passed, and then 1912 which was defeated. As president of the Congress at its Lahore session in 1909, Malviya appreciated the work being undertaken by Gandhi in South Africa. He drew attention to the deep feelings of indignation and grief throughout India due to the unjust, the cruel, the disgraceful treatment to which the Indians living in Transvaal had been subjected. He admired the unflinching courage and unbending determination with which Gandhi had been fighting for the honor of the Indian name, and appealed to the government of India to actively resent and to retaliate the treatment accorded to the Indian fellow subjects. And the least that they ought to do is to withdraw all facilities for enlisting indentured labor for South Africa until the whole colonists there agreed to recognize Indians as their equal fellow subjects. Gokhale's resolution in 1910 on prohibition of indentured labor to Natal, a recommendation which the government had accepted, and then two years later in 1912, Gokhale had brought another resolution calling for total abolition of the indentured labor, which he had described at that time as a monstrous system, iniquitous in itself, based on fraud and maintained by force. However, this resolution did not move forward. Government promised an inquiry, which never happened. In 1916, just a couple of months after the Hindu University was founded, this issue hogged the limelight once again. On 20th March 1916, Malviya moved a resolution for abolition of the system in the Imperial Council. In his speech, he talked about serious abuses that had cropped up under the system in different colonies, and also drew attention to the establishment of recruiting depots at various places in India, from which complaints of kidnapping and other objectionable practices had been received. While highlighting how deep was the indignation among Indians on the mistreatment of their brothers in British colonies, Malviya gave special credit to Gandhi's struggles against the system for bringing the abuses to the public knowledge. He said, the Indian public was in a state of ignorance about the conditions to which Indians under indenture were subjected until the 90s, when Mr. Gandhi began to expose its evils. But both the public and the government realized the seriousness of the problem when the subject was forced upon their attention by the anti-Indian policy of the Transvaal government. He described the system of indentured labor as an unmitigated evil that had worked enough moral havoc during the preceding 8 decades. And it was only with intense pain and humiliation that they could think of the blasted lives of its victims, of the anguish of soul to which they had been subjected to by the system. Calling the indentured labor system a remnant of slavery, Gandhi hoped if Malviya's resolution was accepted, it would enable Hardinge fittingly to close his most eventful viceroyalty, removing this long-standing and acknowledged grievance. However, this was not to happen. In accepting the motion of Malviya, Hardinge announced that he had obtained from His Majesty's government the promise of the abolition of the system in due course. Gandhi felt that it was a very vague assurance. Malviya was convinced that it was the official majority in the council that was the real stumbling block. If the representatives of the people had real and effective voice in the country's administration, he believed the abominable system of indentured labor would have been put an end to many years ago. Lord Chelmsford, who succeeded Hardinge, was not even allowing a vague assurance. Therefore, in February 1917, when Malviya asked for leave to introduce the bill, he refused it. So, the struggle against indentured labor, both by Malviya and Gandhi, finally bore fruits. It was abolished. But Malviya's contribution in the removal of abolition of indentured labor has not been properly highlighted in our modern Indian history. Now, the Home Rule movement, and when in 1917, the government was trying to crush the Home Rule movement, Tilak and Annie Besant, Malviya and Gandhi both came in the forefront to defend the individual rights. He frantically opposed these moves. On 21st February 1917, when a resolution on the Defense of India Act was being discussed in the Imperial Council, Malviya underlined that these special enactments had placed arbitrary powers in the hands of executive officers. As an illustration, he pointed out to the clear misuse of certain provisions under this act to restrain persons like Besant and Tilak from entering any area on the mere suspicion that they were about to act in a manner prejudicial to the public safety. In March, he led a delegation to the Viceroy to protest against the government's effort to stifle the Home Rule movement. In June 1917, Malviya wrote to the editor of the Leader that though he had had sharp differences with Annie Besant in the past, he admired her sacrifices for the cause of Indian progress and reform. I hope she will be allowed to go on with her work. If she is exposed to suffering in that cause, thousands of Indians who have not been able to see eye to eye with her in all things will think it their duty to stand by her and to follow her. Very soon, on 16 June, the governor of Madras ordered Besant's internment. Both Gandhi and Malviya, along with other leaders, vehemently criticized the step. Gandhi visited Allahabad to discuss the matter with Malviya. On 10 July, in a public meeting in Bombay, Malviya asked for resolute action. He also moved a resolution in the Imperial Council asking for her early release. On the education front, inside the legislature, Malviya's contributions are immense. His intervention on the bill moved by Gokhale for making elementary education compulsory and universal in 1912 is remarkable, where Malviya underlined that in some departments of every civilized administration, compulsion was necessary to be introduced. He was trying to counter the critiques of the bill, some of whom had said that universalization is fine, but it should not be compulsory. He drew an analogy, Malviya drew an analogy from the system of vaccination where people, whether they wished it or not, had to subject themselves to the Vaccination Act. If a measure was clearly for the benefit of the people at large, then the principle of compulsion must be introduced. This question of compulsory education of at elementary level figured again prominently in 1924. When speaking in the Central Assembly, Malviya took on the Lee Commission's report on the superior services, especially its recommendation defending recruitment from outside India, in which, among others, removal of communal differences and justice to depressed classes were cited as reasons. Malviya said, "Is it not possible that if the education of the masses had been undertaken on the right scale, such strife and such deplorable riots would have ceased to happen? Even in England, when the masses were not educated, there were most deplorable riots. For 40 years, we have pleaded, implored the government to introduce universal primary education." He then referred to Gokhale's bill, calling it a bill of permissive character, which was defeated along with others by the members of civil services. He called the ICS friends to do a little searching of hearts and see if they were not responsible for the deplorable state of things when they spoke of communal differences. For 40 years, we have pleaded, implored the government to introduce universal primary education. Years have gone by. Crores upon crores of rupees have been found for the military requirements of the country. Crores of rupees have been found for everything which the government decided to do, but education has not yet been brought home to the people to 1/4 or 1/5 or even 1/6 of the extent to which it was ought to be done. He asked the European members of the civil service to stop expressing lip sympathy with the depressed classes and see if they had used all opportunity and power they had to lift them by the strong hands of fellowship. He was also concerned about how legislative business was being conducted and was vehemently opposed to the official majority obstructing the popular measures. Speaking in Madras on India's demand on 31st January 1917, Malviya referred to the scheme proposed by the Congress seeking definite step towards self-government. He pointed out that it was often the secretary of the department or the member or both of them that decided whether a resolution should be accepted or not. And then whatever decision was arrived at by the secretary and the members, it was accepted by the rest of the Executive Council. We feel that the time has come that in matters which affect our domestic progress, the voice of the representatives of the people should have greater weight than the voice of those who are permanent officials in administration. citing several instances of noble initiatives by Indian members being defeated in this manner, like Gokhale's compulsory education bill, indentured labor, question of separation of judicial and executive functions. He sought fundamental changes in law and also in approach. We feel that the interests of progress and the best interests of government, which are cemented in the interests of the people, will be best served by the resolution which provides a check upon hasty measures being carried out or forced upon the executive government, and at the same time provides a safeguard against a good measure being vetoed permanently or for a long time by the government. He wanted the British authorities to know that there was a vast number of Indians, and whose number was growing every day, who were convinced that in order to right many wrongs and to ensure much progress which is essential for the happiness and prosperity of the people of India, it is necessary that the present bureaucratic system of administration should be placed to one in which the representatives of the people shall have the determining voice. We emphatically added that India's connection with England be made more and more honorable and less galling to us, and underlined that it was the strong moral power that endured the Indians to resist the imperialist onslaughts. Quote, I say we cannot tolerate. You might say you have not power, therefore you tolerate. I am speaking of the moral force, of moral considerations, and I say that we educated men of India cannot tolerate the many disabilities under which we labor at present, and therefore we feel it is our duty to see very thing that lies in our power and try constitutionally to bring these facts to the notice of the government and to our fellow men in England, and to press for reform and to see that they are carried out. He was surprised that while the work before the council, he was also surprised that the business hours of the house had substantially decreased, while the work of the council had increased substantially after the Act of 1909. The actual business hours had considerably decreased in recent years to the detriment of public duty. Therefore, he brought a resolution on 9 February 1917 that the council should ordinarily meet at least once in every quarter and once in every week from December to March. Of course, he faced opposition from some Indian members also who were represented by the business and commercial classes, who thought that this will be a necessary wastage of time. He lamented that till the time the capital was in Calcutta, meetings used to be held regularly between December and March, but afterwards the December session had become unknown, and the winter session was practically confined to parts of February and March or January and March. The meetings had become irregular and the dates had also become uncertain. A long gap between the end of March to the middle of September meant that no matters of the public interest could be taken up in the meantime. Again, in the September session, no subject of a controversial nature could be taken up. For such subjects, members had to wait for a full year. In 1918 and 1919, these were his best years in the Central Council. And these were also those years where most controversial legislations were brought about. On 20th August 1918, the Montfort reforms were announced. His Malviya's moderate friends like Hridaynath Kunjuru and Chintamani and Surendranath Banerjee, they felt that Malviya should support these reforms. But to their surprise, he published a long critique of the report, pointing to grave deficiencies which must be made up before the reforms can become adequate to the requirements of the country. It was a very long submission, running into several pages, in which he made a thorough assessment of the proposals, judging both its good and bad sides, and then recommending a thorough modification. He underlined that the Montfort reforms had discarded the vital feature of the proposal submitted by the nationalists, that was, sharing by government of power with the representatives of the people, except only in the case of transferred subjects in the provinces. It was the government responsible to the British Parliament and to the Secretary of State that actually put inherent limitations on it, because it could go only so far as permitted by them and no further. It is only a government of India responsible to the people of India that can be expected to adopt the policies which their interests demand. He took a strong exception. This is very important. He took a strong exception to the statement that existence of different religions, caste, and races in the Indian society constantly threatens its solidarity. These were the points written in the Montfort Reforms document. The people of India, Malviya countered, are more law-abiding than perhaps those of any other country in the world, and that the differences of religion, race, and caste did not stand in the way of their generally living and working together as good neighbors and friends, or of their combining for common purposes. The occasional outbursts of religious feelings, Malvi argued, were due to ignorance which the bureaucracy had failed to remove, and also due to defects of a foreign system of administration, which can only be mitigated by power being substantially shared with the representatives of the people. He noted that Montagu and Chelmsford's understanding that the difficulty that outweighs all others is the existence of religious differences was vastly exaggerated. He clarified that the proneness of the ignorant portion of either community to respond to the cry of religion in danger was due not to religious differences, but due to ignorance, and added that the distinguished authors of the reforms were well aware of such regrettable distempers of ignorance have not been unknown. Such regrettable distempers of ignorance have not been unknown even in England. Quote, I thank God that except in limited periods and areas, the relations between Hindus and Muslims in India have generally been far happier than those that subsisted so long between Protestants and Catholics in Great Britain and Ireland. The regrettable outbursts of religious animosities have been occasional and fleeting and remediable, and have been confined to a few places in the country. Concluding his very long submission, Malvi demanded that the provisional governments to be made autonomous immediately, and a time frame ought to be fixed, whose outer limit should not be beyond 20 years, in which a full responsible government should be established at the center. And in this period, education should be made universal and industries could be developed so as to make the country self-sufficient in respect of ordinary needs of the country. He demanded that fiscal autonomy must be granted if industries in India had to secure a fair future. And for that to happen, power must be vested in the representatives of the people in the central government to lay down the policy which the executive was to carry out. It was high time, he suggested, when the responsibility of the Secretary of State were replaced by responsibility to properly constituted representative councils of the people. Now comes 1919, Rowlatt Bills, Jallianwala Bagh incident, Punjab martial law, and the indemnity bill. It were the discussions on the Rowlatt Bills in February and March and the indemnity bill in September 1918 that witnessed the most fiery anti-imperialist speaker in Pandit Malviya. Speaking passionately on the Rowlatt Bill in the Imperial Council on 6 February 1919, he asked government to reconsider its position, to not lead people to think that the great sacrifice which they made during the war had already begun to be forgotten. The government should show by their acts that they still do trust the people, and that what they say about the deep loyalty of the people is a reality which they believe in and not an unreal sentiment expressed to flatter the people. He painted the Rowlatt Bills as retrograde and repressive, and also subversive of so many ideas of justice for the protection of the liberty of individual. When he resigned his seat following the passage of the Rowlatt Act, the newspaper leader noted that Malviya's first election to the Imperial Council in 1910, to which he was re-elected in 1913 and 16, and during the 10 sessions he served his country in the council with unselfish devotion. All along he acted in the faith that the salvation of the country he loves lay in cooperation between the government and the representatives of the people. At last, the faith seems to have given way under the stress of the unfortunate Rowlatt legislation, falling upon events or incidents that showed during the last 1 year that a certain coldness was growing between him and the members of the government. He was back to the council in September 19, and he put an advance notice for a large number of questions to be asked from the government. And to be precise, they were 60 in number on the Punjab affairs. And these questions included most minute details about the number of people arrested, detained, and convicted, along with their complete details, cases decided by different courts, number of persons killed or wounded on different dates and occasions, reasons for deportation of Satyapal and Kichlu, legal background and nationalist emotions combined. He sought every possible detail about the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy, starting from the proclamation, if any, for prohibition of meetings to the number of persons assembled. When and by whom the meeting at the Bagh was advertised in the city, When did authorities come to know that such a meeting was going to be held? Steps taken by the authorities to make it known to the persons assembling that the meeting was prohibited. When did people begin to assemble? Was there any reconnoitering by aeroplane over the Bagh at that time before the military arrived? Steps taken to disperse the crowd before the military arrived. By whose orders military was sent there? After arrival, how long did they take to open fire? Did the military open fire on its own, or order was given by any magistrate? Total number of persons killed, wounded, who subsequently died, wounded, who survived. Were there any ambulance or first aid arrangements previously made by the authorities for the wounded? Was there any order enforced at Amritsar on 13th April prohibiting people from leaving the houses after 8 p.m.? How long after the firing was the Bagh cleared of all corpses, and by what agency? Whether any boys or children were shot or otherwise killed or injured at the Bagh? So these were the detailed questions that he asked to the Home member in September 1919. And then when he was speaking in the council on 18th September, he raised strong objections of on the personal as well as the terms of reference of the Hunter Committee. It was around that time that the Hunter Committee was announced. The first point of objection that he raised was that this committee would report to the Viceroy. And then he said that this was an inbuilt contradiction in the whole proposal, because Government of India itself was closely identified with events in the Punjab with which inquiry was related. It was Government of India or Governor General in Council who had declared that there was a state of open rebellion in Lahore and Amritsar. That was the starting point of the chapter of troubles. It was the Governor General in Council who promulgated the martial law ordinances. It was he who supported and sustained the late Lieutenant Governor Odar in carrying on the martial law administration there. He therefore demanded that inquiry committee report not to GG, Governor General in Council, but to the Secretary of State. Government should heed to the public opinion of the country. And the second point that he raised was about the personnel of the committee. Out of the 6 members, only 2 were Indians. So he wanted at least one and another Indian on the committee. The third point that he raised was that the terms of reference were insufficient. The committee itself had not been given any judicial powers to annul or modify sentences. He said that either it be constituted into a court for which either this council should pass an act constituting it as a judicial tribunal, or parliament should do it. And then he said, "My lord, comparatively the sentences do not mean so much. What matters most to every decent citizen, to every loyal subject, to every gentleman, is that his honor should remain stainless, that the stain which has been cast upon his honor be completely wiped off." The Viceroy announced the appointment of a committee chaired by Hunter, and on the same day, 18th September, followed with the introduction of the Indemnity Bill. His speech made a spirited argument for not moving ahead with the Indemnity Bill and wait instead for the report of the Committee of Inquiry. This was by far his longest speech in the council, 4.5 hours, where he concluded, "I make this appeal in the name of those who have lost their lives, in the name of those who lost their limbs in these recent disturbances, in the name of those who have suffered indescribable indignities, in the name of those who are undergoing imprisonment at this moment unjustly in His Majesty's jails, in the name of those women who are in mourning by the loss of their husbands, their relations or sons, in the name of all those, my lord, I appeal to your excellency's government to stay the hand of government and to wait for the committee of inquiry and then to decide what should be done." Malviya's interventions on economic issues were also very prominent. He had long been an advocate of Swadeshi, about preserving Indian industries, about promoting technical education. In 1898, he proposed that the government ought to foster native industries and native arts. In the Congress session, he asked, "Where are the weavers? Where are those men who lived by different industries and manufactures? And where are the manufacturers which went to England and other European countries in large quantities year after year?" His interest continued and, of course, expanded in the early 20th century. He helped to found the Indian Industrial Conference at Banaras in 1905 and the United Provincial Industrial Association at Allahabad in 1907, and took very active interest in their deliberations. In the founding of the Prayag Sugar Company Limited, he had a They had an important role. Over the years, he also evolved as a prominent advocate of promoting technical education, which also formed the earliest and most fundamental part of the Hindu University scheme. As a member of the Indian Industrial Commission appointed in 1916, which submitted its report in 1918, Malviya presented a long and well-researched note of dissent, pointing out his points of disagreement. In this long report, running into more than 100 pages, one would hardly find an area of critical economic inquiry into India's poverty, as also tangible suggestions for her industrial progress left untouched. He suggested numerous ways in which India could develop its industries in its own interest. Malviya said he was constantly reminded of the erroneous notion which many Europeans held about India, that she must remain a mainly agricultural country, that the people in India are by nature and tradition deficient in industrial capacity and commercial enterprise, and that in contrast, these qualities are inherent in the nations of the West. The decline of Indian industries, the growing imports of British manufacturers, and the export of raw materials from India led inevitably to the impoverishment of the manufacturing classes in all parts of the country and drove a growing proportion of the population to depend more and more upon the land. By the combined operation of these two causes, the country was reduced to an economic condition which exposed it to the aggravated evils of frequent famines. He complained that hardly anything was done to encourage indigenous industries and still less to promote technical education. After 1922, after the non-cooperation movement, when he entered the assembly in 1923, he saw to it that there was a big nationalist opposition inside the assembly. So the non-party candidates, he formed a group called Independent Group, and together with the Swarajist groups, they formed a nationalist party or nationalist group inside the legislature, which stood as one group on many affairs, many questions of nationalist importance. In February 1924, he rose to support a resolution for a revision of the Government of India Act. And while he rose to support, the Home Member Malcolm Haley interjected in between and asked whether the dominion status sought was for at once. Malviya was visibly irritated and said that Haley seemed to think that India is a primitive country which had never known civilization and which for the first time under the tutorship of England learnt about civilized administration, and Indians therefore required to be taken from stage to stage for the art of self-government. Speaking on the finance bill in March 1924, he underlined the irony. The assembly was empowered to vote taxes without having the right to decide how the resulting revenues would be spent, as the bulk of the expenditure which were incurred on defense and civil services and other heads were non-votable. In 1927, in the newly elected Central Assembly, Malviya spoke in favor of Motilal Nehru's resolution that the large number of political prisoners who had been under preventive detention for the last 27 months without trial should either be released immediately or brought to trial before the appropriate courts. He blamed the government for keeping them in detention without any reason and under what was being described as a lawless law, referring to detention to a large number of the Swaraj Party workers by the Bengal government. He sarcastically remarked, "I cannot help saying that there is no human weakness which is standing. There is one human weakness which is standing in the way of the release, and that is the high officials' jid." During late 1927, Malviya played a crucial role in mobilizing the Hindu Mahasabha in supporting the Congress resolution for the backout of the Salmon Commission. Along with B.S. Munje, M.R. Jaikar and Lajpat Rai, Malviya prevailed upon the Mahasabha to fall in line with the backout of the commission, and a resolution to this effect was passed during the Madras session of the Mahasabha on 29 December 1927. Addressing the Muslim League session in Kolkata on 1st January 1928, Malviya called the Salmon Commission a God-given opportunity to arouse them to a sense of duty and appeal to the countrymen to be united with only one desire, to be just to each other and to have confidence in each other, always remembering that they were Indians first.
Bhuvanji, if I may interrupt you, please try to conclude in the next 5 minutes.
Yes. He also played an important role in securing the Mahasabha's report in favor of the report of Mahasabha's support in favor of the report of the Nehru Committee. On 7th March 1930, Sardar Patel was arrested. Malviya immediately moved an adjournment motion in the Central Assembly to draw attention to the arbitrary manner of his arrest. On 2nd April, Malviya resigned from the House, protesting against the passage of the Cotton Textile Tariff Bill, which gave unreasonably heavy preference to British industry at the cost of Indian industries. He said, to indicate the measure of loss only in one direction. It is calculated that from 1909 to 1929, gold resources to the extent of about rupees 140 crores have been frittered away by government in their effort to bolster up the exchange. It will be my earnest and prayerful endeavor to devote all my time and effort to see that this system is in place as early as possible by a system worthy of the name of government. On 27 August 1930, he was arrested in Delhi for participating in the meeting of the Congress committee, was put in Naini jail, from which he was released 4 months later. At the second roundtable conference, Malviya accompanied Gandhi to England and was the next to speak after Gandhi had spoken. I'm quoting from his speech. Mr. Gandhi exercises a most tremendous influence on the people of India, but I regret to say that even his influence will not be sufficient to satisfy the cravings of the people for freedom. I have mentioned the case of Ireland. It may be said that in that case there was a war and that an agreement was arrived at the end of a war. I hope, Mr. Prime Minister, you at least will not say so, because I am certain that the method of war cannot compare with the method of non-violent civil disobedience or passive resistance, which Mr. Gandhi has inculcated on the people to suffer wrong, to suffer injustice, to suffer pain, and to suffer loss. But that method does not involve less heavy sacrifice than the method of violence and war. And I submit we should begin a new era in the history of mankind. So I would conclude my lecture, my talk. From the time of his first major public appearance in 1886 to the Faizpur session of the Congress in 1936, Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya had devoted 50 most active years of his life to the cause that lay very close to his heart. In this effort, his interventions in the legislatures definitely stand out. Taking the constitutionalist roadmap devised by the early nationalists, he did not conform to the conventions of any one school of opinion. So when the Montfort reforms were announced, to the detriment of his close moderate friends like Chintamani Banerjee and Hridainath Kunjuru, he decided to draw a strong critique of these recommendations. He also refused to side with this group in their opposition to the Gandhi's anti-Rowlatt Satyagraha and wholeheartedly supported it. Similarly, when he saw limitations in the Swarajist approach to the legislatures, he found his own way out, but always coordinated and led the nationalist opposition, including the Swarajists in the Central Assembly. His stint in the Central Council personified the best parliamentary practices of the late colonial era, basing his arguments on strong evidences, supporting and opposing measures purely on their merit and without any personal consideration, and then finally balancing his conclusions. Thank you so much for hearing me so patiently. Thank you, Dr. Ravikant Mishra. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Bhuvan Jha, for your very comprehensive and insightful presentation. We are now open to questions and comments from all the participants. You can also ask your question by typing it in the chat box in case there is some problem with your audio.
They can unmute their mic while they ask questions.
Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
I'm Ritesh. I teach history in Janki Devi Memorial College.
Okay.
Thank you for a very informative and wonderful presentation on Madan Mohan Malviya's political life.
Thank you, Ritesh.
Sir, as I see it, you are trying to make an argument that he is essentially in a liberal, moderate frame. He's taking up issues of self-rule, indentured labor, Indianization of civil services, and all. Now, my question to you is that, and as I understand Madan Mohan Malviya's career, he's a great Hindu leader. He's been termed as Mahamana by none other than Mahatma Gandhi. And 1920s onwards, the political climate of India completely changes, following the calling off of the non-cooperation movement. There are communal rights everywhere. And it is at this precise moment that in this decade that Madan Mohan Malviya is in central legislature. And 1927 onwards, we have Simon Commission report also being sort of worked up, and Indian response to it is the Nehru report. Now, the point is, surely the Hindu-Muslim issues are coming up in the parliament, within the parliament. Now, I would have wanted you to discuss those Hindu-Muslim issues in more detail, because this is what the Mahamana that at least I understand. And please sort of clarify further if there's a problem in my questioning. Thank you, sir.
Very good question, Riteshji, and thank you so much for raising this question. Inside the central legislature, Hindu-Muslim questions are not being debated. They come as part of discussion on certain resolutions. So when it came as part of discussions on Montfort reforms, or subsequently during 1920s, he did speak, like I said about 1924 when he was speaking on the Lee Commission. About the Hindu-Muslim problem, he was well aware of these problems. He was part of the Hindu Mahasabha, presiding over its sessions from 1922 to 1925. But he did not represent a very aggressive, did not represent an aggressive face of the Hindu Mahasabha. He tried to confine Hindu Mahasabha to the social cause. And when the occasion for elections came, he did not want Hindu Mahasabha to contest elections. For example, in 1926, when he broke off his relationship with Swarajists, he formed an independent party called Independent Congress Party. So if some Hindu Mahasabhite wants to fight as a good Hindu leader, he should take the route of Independent Congress Party. Similarly, in 1934, he founded the Congress Nationalist Party and did not want Hindu Mahasabha to contest elections directly. The same thing happened in 1937. So he said that to espouse the nationalist cause, Congress should act as a platform. So people from Muslim League or Hindu Mahasabha or anywhere else, if they want to fight for a nationalist cause, they should jump to the Congress platform. He founded the Congress Nationalist Party in 1934 because he was offended by its ambiguous attitude towards the communal award. So he's a Hindu leader, there is no doubt about that. He's a nationalist leader, there is no doubt about that. He's also a leader who is a votary of Hindu-Muslim unity. He's a leader who wants Hindu unity to come up. He's a leader who wants Hindu-Muslim unity to come up. So there are different facets of his life. In the Central Assembly, in the Central Legislature, he's trying to push this point time and again that this communal problem is our problem. It should not be vitiated by the British authorities or the bureaucracy. Let you allow us enough freedom to govern ourselves and we can tackle these problems. These are not problems which we cannot tackle. So this is how he approached the problem. And I don't think that he was oblivious of these issues, but these issues were not brought for discussions in the assembly in the same manner as they do now. So there are different procedures through which an issue can be raised. Mostly they are through resolutions or discussions through those resolutions. I hope I have made my point, Riteshji.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Pleasure.
Hello.
Yes.
I'm Amrit Kaur Basra speaking.
Hi, Amrit.
As usual, this has been a wonderful narration. In
Thank
fact,
you.
legislative politics and the real role of Mahamana as a leader of people of India, rather I would say. And there was no contradiction, as I understand, the issue between having identity with Hinduism and working for the mass of Indian population, for that matter. I was wondering, you could have thrown a little bit more light on his relationship with the Swarajists and no changers.
Yes. I think, since I was focusing more on his speeches inside the legislatures, and of course there were portions in my speech, in my lecture, which contained this Swarajist conflict during 1925 and 26, in which Lajpat Rai and Malviya were working closely together. And when the Independent Congress Party was founded, Lajpat Rai was at the helm of affairs. So
Right.
this was there, and when a paper is published, you will certainly find his colleagues, mention of his colleagues inside the party.
Okay, thanks.
Any other question or comment?
हेलो.
Yes, please go ahead.
हाँ सर, सृजन शुक्ला इस साइड से.
Yes, go ahead.
हाँ,
Go ahead.
बताइए शुक्ला जी.
हाँ सर, ये था कि जैसे अगली बार से आप जब अगली बार लेक्चर दें तो थोड़ा और टाइम लेके आइएगा, ठीक है? क्योंकि वो जल्दी से रश होने लगा ना, तो काफी सारी चीजें, काफी सारे क्वेश्चंस जो आ सकते थे वो थोड़े
आप क्वेश्चन पूछ, देखिए कुछ समय क्वेश्चन आंसर के लिए बचा के रखा गया है, तो आपके मन में यदि कोई बात हो जो छूट गया है तो आप पूछें और फिर हम उस पर चर्चा करेंगे.
सर, बस ये एक सजेशन था कि अगली बार से थोड़ा और टाइम लेके आइए.
नहीं, होता क्या है कि जो हमारा समय है उसका एक है कि 1 घंटा सवा घंटा में उसको करना है, उसमें क्वेश्चन आंसर भी है, इंट्रोडक्शन भी है, तमाम तरह की चीजें हैं. वैसे कुछ सवाल आपके मन में हो तो आप पूछें, हम लोग यहाँ चर्चा करेंगे.
नहीं सर, पूछ लेंगे, हम अलग से पूछते हैं.
थैंक यू. हाँ, जानकी वांटेड टू आस्क समथिंग.
No, I just said thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Janki. Thank you, Janki.
Is there any other question? All right. Malvi, sorry, Bhuvanji. I would like to know from you, as you have, beautifully charted out in your very comprehensive lecture, Malviji's contribution to the history of legislation during the British period, especially in the first half of the 20th century, was immense. And he has addressed a variety of issues of concern to the Indian society in his various addresses, and in various ways he contributed to the betterment of our people. Now one question that arises is, why is it that only one aspect of Malviji's achievements, immense achievements, has been highlighted, and so many other aspects of Malviji's role during the freedom struggle have been relatively neglected? What do you see as the historiographic reason behind this?
I think I can only make guesses, because during the period that he was active,
just a moment. And related to this, actually, the real question is this: you have dug into the historiography of Madan Mohan Malvi, so you are best placed to answer this question. This neglect of Madan Mohan Malvi's role in the legislature and in other spheres, when and how did it start? I mean, did it start in the 1950s, 60s, 70s? What were the processes that went into it? Because so far as I'm aware, till the time Malviji was alive in 1946, I think he died in 1946. Till that time, at least, Malviji was not seen simply as an educationist. He was seen in his totality, and all aspects of his contribution to India were well recognized. But I presume that this process started after his death. So because you have worked on the archives, are you able to pinpoint any specific period, any decade when this process started?
It's very difficult to see precisely the point or timeline from which this disengagement.
Not an exact timeline, but some rough idea.
But I don't find any reference even in the standard history textbooks of 1970s or 80s referring to Malviya, except in some sense that he was there instrumental in the Pune Pact, or he went along with Gandhi to the Round Table Conference. But this vast career in legislatures is thoroughly absent. We hardly find any reference to Malviya's career inside legislatures, how he's speaking on Jallianwala Bagh, how he's speaking about the indemnity bill, how he's speaking on the Montfort reforms. These whole episodes are almost silenced. One reason could be that a certain group of historians started identifying him as a Hindu communal leader. And a certain group of historians thus limited his persona to the Hindu university, or confining him to his educationist efforts alone. And this is a big surprise to me, because the kind of contributions that Malviya makes in the late colonial period is second only to Gandhi's contributions. Yes. And if you reckon his contributions in the field of education, in the field of legislature, in the field of economic development, there's no reason why he should have been silenced. But that's the tragedy. That is the tyranny. Maybe he belonged to the earlier league of liberals and moderates, as my friend has pointed out, but he was always willing to reinvent himself. And by 1919, he was more so in the Gandhian mold for certain years. So he is a non-conventional moderate, a non-conventional liberal, who is not afraid of talking about Hindu interests also. But he's talking about Hindu-Muslim communal unity also. He talks about Hindu interests, but he's not talking about Hindu communal interests.
Yeah, the reason
we need to make this distinction.
The specific reason I asked you this question, because I was curious about it. In the historical sources that we find from the 1930s and 40s at least, and in the comments of his contemporaries, I have never come across anything which describes Malvi as a Hindu communal leader.
No,
this is something that developed much later, certainly not in his lifetime.
Yeah. If you look at Rajendra Prasad's autobiography, there's a very sympathetic treatment of Malviya's politics, of his activities, and how important Malviya was in different deliberations. Even in the Jinnah Rajendra Prasad talks during February 1935, Malviya was an important player.
So which would mean that it was a post facto analysis of Malviyaji's politics, which sort of took it in a different direction.
True. Because till the time he was alive, he had differences with his congressmen, but there were many supporters within the Congress for his cause also. And mind you, when he founded this Congress Nationalist Party in 1934, he made it very clear that we are not different from the Congress. Only difference that we have with the Congress is that they are ambiguous about the communal award, while we wholeheartedly oppose the communal award. And he said that even if a Hindu Mahasabhite has to contest election, he should come on this platform. And so he has a very wide canvas in which he's making his deliberations. And of course, he was misunderstood during his times also, but not by majority. By minority. Like when in 1926 the elections were held, he brought Ghanshyam Das Birla from Calcutta to fight against Sri Prakash for the Gorakhpur constituency, and that became a big news during that time.
Anyway, we will carry on this discussion. I'm really very thankful to you for making this beautiful presentation here, and I'm thankful to all the participants who have found time this afternoon to join this lecture. We'll carry on the discussion. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ravikant. Thank you so much to the participants, to distinguished people who came here.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you for all of you being here.